On behalf of CIBS and the members of our governing board, I'd like to welcome everyone to our latest Lunch and Learn presentation with our very special guest, Chuck Merritt, President and sole owner of Merritt Consulting Corporation. Our topic today will cover the new ASTM, which is the American Society for Testing and Materials, Phase 1 environmental standards that were adopted in late 2021. The ASTM standard has been the industry go-to document for environmental consultants when providing clients with the necessary environmental due diligence. As sole owner and president of Merritt Environmental, Chuck oversees all operations and client relations from his headquarters in Hauppauge, as well as satellite offices in Vermont and South Florida. Chuck is a recognized expert in the field of environmental consulting and an environmental and lead accredited professional. Chuck has been listed by Long Island Business News as a who's who in engineering and environmental consulting, as well as one of the top CEOs on Long Island. Merritt Environmental Consulting provides comprehensive consulting expertise to the commercial real estate industry. For more than 2 decades, Merritt has been providing environmental assessments with a quick turnaround time and a strong desire to see transactions finalized. Merritt has been retained by some of the best-known financial institutions, as well as many real estate attorneys and landlords across the United States. Chuck is a graduate of Adelphi University. Chuck will take questions during and after his presentation. Please use the chat and raise your hand icons at the bottom of your screen for questions. So please join me in a very warm welcome for Chuck Merritt. Welcome, Chuck.
Thank you, Leo, and thank you, Christine, for the opportunity to speak to the group today. I've been a member of CIBS for many years. I know many of the members and gone to many of the networking events over the years. So when this opportunity came up, I thought it would be a good opportunity to go over the new ASTM standards. With every set of standards that come out, they sort of put the onus on consultants to do a little more work, include a little more information, and try to better the overall report. So what I'd like to do over the next half hour or so is go over a PowerPoint presentation pointing out some of the key changes of the new standard. I also have a few slides I'd like to share with you that may be of some assistance to the U.S. brokers that are approaching these type of properties, either representing a buyer or representing a seller. And then, as Christine mentioned, at any point you want to raise your hand or take a question, I'm more than happy to try to answer throughout the presentation or at the end. So I'll start going through these and see if I can bring some information to the group that is deemed helpful with environmental Phase 1 reports. So the new ASTM Phase 1 standard is a standard that is approved by Congress. So this is the 3rd version. There are versions of ASTM that go back to the early 90s, but it's the 2000, which was the 3rd version, which ended up needing the Federal Environmental Protection Agency's approval. With that approval came a mandatory 8-year revision cycle. That's currently where we're at. ASTM did approve their version of the standard. I was one of the members of that committee over the last 18 months that through Zoom meetings similar to this one and other webinars where we tried to bring the best ideas forward from consultants, real estate attorneys, lenders, regulators throughout the country. The only thing that is missing at this point is that the EPA's final determination of the new standard. It is expected to happen this year. Could happen as early as June. It may happen as late as the 3rd or the 4th quarter of 2022. So with that being said, most consultants right now are waiting for the final EPA approval before they amend their reports. Nobody believes that it's going to be a total rewrite or go back to the drawing board and start again. But I think there is a little apprehension amongst the consulting environment right now that if I start changing my reports and EPA comes back with additional revisions, that we're going to have to be going back to our reports a second The ASTM report is designed to meet definition of the requirements of CERCLA, which is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Surplus Liability Act, and all appropriate inquiry. So this document, the phase 1 document that buyers obtain, is designed to protect them or exempt them from any liability of site cleanup costs that may already exist at a property. So if you were to do no due diligence, find out you purchased a property with a lot of problems, go to the regulators and say, well, I didn't do it, someone else did it, the first question they're going to ask is, well, where's your phase 1 report? So without that in hand, regulators are going to tell that person, well, I'm sorry, but you can now be considered a prospective responsible party to the cleanup action that was caused by somebody else. So it is an important document for that reason alone. Some of the notable changes to the standard, and keep in mind, most of these are really in the consultant's lap. We as consultants sort of have to adhere to the major and minor changes to the report and some of the nuances that have occurred. But just to point out some of the larger, more notable changes that are going to be in this version. The observations, positive, negative, and site visits must be documented by photos. You would tend to think that that's pretty obvious. I review a lot of reports for lenders and other clients, and most reports usually do include a good amount of photographs of the property. Addition, clarification of several of the definitions. Again, that's one of those nuanced changes where really it's in the lap of the consultant to understand that. Increased requirements for the scope of historical research. They call them the big 4 that are out there. They're the aerial maps, they're Sanborn maps, they're city directories, and they're topographical maps. So consultants are supposed to have all 4 at their disposal to review. Sometimes they're not available. A lot of areas in Suffolk County were just developed more recently, and they didn't really have the Sanborn historical maps out that far. But what you're supposed to do is say, okay, if you can't get access to this one, go to the next one. Don't just stop and say, well, there was no coverage. Clarify the 180-day shelf life of the report begins to run from the date of the first task is conducted. All reports are supposed to indicate that 180 days, 6 months is really the ASTM shelf life. Once a report runs beyond that, we're supposed to do and conduct additional or go back and conduct a new interview or to renew database. But I guess there's always been sort of some confusion. Is it the day we started the report? Is it the day the report went out to the client? And that can be, several weeks in time frame. So this is designed to clarify that. What I have in red over here, I'm going to spend the next couple of slides addressing because this is really the crux of where our industry has gone. Emerging contaminants, forever chemicals, they're known as PFAS. They're currently an issue in many states. The ASTM standard is leaving it as a non-scope consideration. The reason they're doing that is these chemicals are not yet considered a hazardous substance by the federal government. Therefore, it doesn't meet the definition of the CERCLA event. But there are many states, New York being one of them, that sort of gotten ahead of the federal government and are setting their own standards and their own limits as to what they want to, what they will allow in PFAS, that to exist. A lot of these now are starting to be brought down to the level of parts per trillion, which can become a very low amount of something. The way someone described it to me was it's basically a couple of cups in an Olympic swimming pool. And you can trigger an event where you have to sort of be a little more aware of what the PFAS or emerging contaminants are. So let's go through the next few slides and focus a little bit on these emerging contaminants. So it clarifies the new standard that consultants should be talking to their clients, even though it's not in the baseline scope of a phase 1 and it's considered this non-scope consideration. But you really should have a discussion with the client. Do they want it? Do they need it? Will their bank want it? Is it in an area that it would produce valuable data? But what are these chemicals? They're widely used, long-lasting chemicals which break down very slowly over time. Because of their widespread use and persistence in the environment, they're found in the blood of people and animals all over the world, present at low levels in a variety of food products and in the environment. You can't really get away from them. They're found in the water, they're found in the air, they're found in the fish we eat, they're found in a lot of consumer products. The Teflon on a frying pan contains PFAS. So it's out there in minor levels in some areas and more significant levels in others. Studies have shown exposure to PFAS in the environment may be linked to harmful human effects in humans, or I should say harmful health effects in humans and animals. There are thousands of PFAS chemicals that are out there, different consumer products, so it's hard to get away from them. For those of us that watch a little TV or a lot of TV, you're starting to see the law firms advertise this, where 10 years ago, a lot of ads were on television by law firms. If you were exposed to asbestos, call us. Now you're starting to see advertisements for law firms telling people if they think they were exposed to PFAS to call them. The two main manufacturers were 3M and DuPont. There are hundreds of lawsuits around the country right now. There are a few right here on Long Island where they're trying to get these large chemical companies to the table for a settlement. And eventually, like the asbestos industry, I'm sure there'll be some large fund established, and then lawyers will have to bring their plaintiffs in, have to try to prove that they have exposure to these PFAS chemicals. And I guess the end goal is to get some money out of the fund for their clients and also to cover the law firm's fees. There's a couple of websites here that I've provided. I think Christine can at some point provide this presentation to those that would like it. They're informative. They give you a little bit more information about PFAS and how regulators are addressing them, where you can find them, what the health effects are. So the large contributors of PFAS into the soil, the groundwater, and also the air are airports, military installations, industrial and manufacturing plants. So the big three of Long Island, everybody knows these sites to some degree: Grumman facility in Hicksville, Calverton Airport out in Calverton, and Gabreski Airport in West Hampton. All former military operations managed by the United States Navy. So when listings come up, when properties are sort of in your wheelhouse, and they happen to be near these type of facilities, just be aware that a buyer's consultant may flag it, may point it out, may make additional recommendations in their reports for things maybe that you haven't seen before. Same thing with lenders. If they're ordering the environmental report, their consultants may come back to them and say, be aware this property exists in an area that may be down gradient of PFAS. And this is the key slide. I know it's a little grainy, and I'm sorry about that, but it gives you the idea. You see the large airplane right there with the U.S. Marines sort of logo on the side. You see the fire truck, and you see the firefighters with the foam. Whether this was a practice drill and an exercise in how to possibly put out a fire involving jet fuel, or an actual emergency response to a situation, I'm not completely sure. But this white foam eventually gets washed down into the soil, migrates down into the groundwater, and eventually into the drinking water supply. So you can see why or how the chemicals can permeate into our environment and be problematic. Just sort of kind of going over what was already in the prior slide about how it's found in many products. Once it gets into the sewer, the wastewater is discharged back into the environment. This chemicals can be expensive to remediate. They're being detected in human body tissue, and they do not go away on their own. So it's sort of a cartoonish photo down on the bottom right of the pipe discharging into the waterways with the cans and the bottles. Well, that's PFAS also. I grew up in Queens, and there was the Frogs Neck military base that was dumping mercury into the water, Little Neck Bay, for many, many years. And it was always a sign that if you went fishing down in Little Neck Bay, do not eat the fish, because there was suspected of having large mercury content. Because of the mercury the military base was using, became pretty well known. And mercury can be a very dangerous chemical if it's ingested in large quantities. So this is sort of the same idea. These PFAS, forever emerging contaminant chemicals, are getting into the water. The fish are there for eating it and ingesting it. And if we're eating the fish, you know, it's just another way of these toxins to be brought into our body. So Long Island is unique in the fact that we have a sole source aquifer. The 5 boroughs of New York City and beyond use reservoir systems in upstate New York in the watershed area, and then they pipe the water down in large aqueducts, treated at the city level, and it's dispersed to the residents of the 5 boroughs. We don't have that sort of aqueduct system and municipal water supply. We drill down to the aquifers underneath Long Island. And this picture here sort of gives you a little understanding of how it all works and where it all ends up. You know, what's interesting about the Magathi Aquifer, which is the shallow one, is you can see it actually flows underneath the Atlantic Ocean. So it's fresh water for a point, and then eventually, I guess, the further it gets out into the ocean, the more it mixes with salt water. But as you can see from the top text bar there, you know, eventually everything, good and bad, ends up in our drinking water supply. And this slide does a good job of really just sort of, you know, pointing that out. Every few years, there's talk of going deeper and deeper, but the Lloyd Aquifer is the deepest. And once we tap into the Lloyd Aquifer, that's the last source of fresh water we have on Long Island. So I have a couple of slides here that just to try to be helpful to the audience and how maybe you could be better prepared when you're showing properties. So if you're representing a buyer, you know, just a couple of bullets that'll kind of help you understand, you know, how you can move things forward in getting a deal done the fastest way possible. Is the buyer getting financing from a lender? Once you bring a lender to the table, they become your partner. And now you got to make them happy. And if it's an SBA loan, SBA has an even more comprehensive, thorough threshold of what they deem clean. So consultants work in this environment every day. I can speak to a client buying a property, tells me, I don't care, that's fine, I'm not worried about it, I'm getting a great price on the building. And then they go to the bank. And all of a sudden, things get a little more difficult on their end. And the reason why, sometimes a loan officer can tell the person they're working with, no problem, no problem. But it's the credit risk officer at the bank. He's the person ultimately, or she's the person ultimately, who has to sign off that in their mind, after reviewing all the documents, they don't think that there's any credit risk to the loan or the collateral of the loan. And it's not just environmental. Certainly, it can be the financials of a borrower. Certainly, it can be past bankruptcies a borrower may have undergone that can, you know, impact the lending institution's comfort level with that particular person. And do they have a strict time frame for closing that will need to be extended if additional environmental investigation is required? I know 1031s are a big deal when you're selling a property. You got to go out and buy something within 6 months so you can avoid some tax consequences. So if you're at the 5-month, 3-week mark and you identify a problem and the consultant comes back and says, well, did you know about the 3 underground storage tanks in the backyard? You know, that that time of the essence deal now, and that 10/31 deadline is going to quickly be in jeopardy if additional work needs to be done. So if you're representing a seller, how do we try to get that information out to make the transition or the transaction go quicker? Are they aware of any past environmental issues? Did they conduct the phase one when they purchased the building? I think the average life cycle for commercial real estate is about 5 to 7 years. So they may very well have been a report done by them or their lender, but now they're getting ready to sell. We should take a look at it, see what came up then. Were those issues addressed and reconciled? It's good information for the next consultant and the next buyer. Have you converted the building to gas from oil? If you did, what happened to the oil tank? Is it just disconnect the lines and walk away and connect to the grid for gas? These are questions that are going to come up during the sale or during the due diligence of a buyer. Are they connected to a municipal sewer system? Most of Suffolk County, even today, still has on-site sanitary with cesspools and septic tanks. That can become an issue during a purchase. Consultants point these out all the time because they tend to collect and hold any legacy issues. Municipal sewer, it'll pump it into a bunch of pipes. Eventually, it'll end up in that water supply that we saw that big pipe pushing it out before. But if it's an on-site sanitary system, a lot of these legacy issues tend to stay around for a long time. And these are areas that consultants are going to focus on. Will a seller allow a buyer the opportunity for additional investigation if requested? Sometimes sellers will say, absolutely not. I think as brokers, it's important, it's incumbent on you to get that answer before you spend a lot of your time, blood, sweat, and tears trying to get something sold, only to find out a seller was never going to allow the next step, the phase two. Buyer typically pays for it. But is there a reason a seller doesn't want a phase two done? Do they know something they're not disclosing? Did they have an issue on a past transaction that they did on a different building? Where all of a sudden, the deal fell apart and they're left cleaning up an environmental problem. A, they didn't even know they had. B, they really, wish they had never known about it anyway. But now the regulators have been notified, the bank knows about it, the lawyers know about it. Now it's sort of become something a little bit more of public record. And that can make a seller queasy. So it's understandable if something like that happened in the past to a seller, why they would be hesitant to allow a phase two on this property. But I think it's a fair question. I think it's a discussion you want to have so you know what you can expect when the phase one comes in. So this slide here just, this is the perfect world. This is utopia. Get all the parties communicating, buyer, seller, lawyers, environmental consultants. There's no reason we as consultants shouldn't speak with one another. If I'm representing a buyer and a seller has an environmental consultant who he calls in after reviewing the phase one, we can chat. We can decide what work should be done. A seller's environmental consultant will advocate for them. A buyer's environmental consultant will advocate for them. But there's room in the middle to discuss it. We don't have to be totally at odds with each other. We should try to find the middle. But that really comes from communicating over the phone or other, email, whatever it may be. The goal is to get every transaction closed, and everyone plays a role in that. The two lawyers, two consultants, the buyer and the seller. Sometimes there isn't time to get a deal done. Well, I shouldn't say get a deal done, get an environmental issue addressed. Maybe the seller gives the buyer credit. Says, I'll take off X amount of dollars, you deal with it after you close. Banks, if they have a cost to cure number and an estimate, become more likely to want to close that loan once they have that. Typically, a phase one, it's hard to come up with the cost to cure. Phase 2, if it's a few soil samples, a few groundwater samples, once we have that data, we can come up with an estimate. We can go back to the lender and say, looks like it's probably $50,000 to $60,000 to clean it up, whatever, if that's the number. Banks will get a little more comfortable knowing the number, whether they escrow it, whether they add more to it. But it's certainly a way when time is of the essence to try to get everybody to agree on a solution. Again, we're talking utopia here. A buyer should be ordering their own report. It's a contractual relationship, consultant to buyer. Consultant puts his insurance up. Consultant puts his best foot forward. Consultant gives a buyer the best expertise they can. When a bank orders that report through a consultant, the report belongs to the bank. And suddenly there's now an arm's length relationship to the buyer. It happens more times than you would think. Buyer lets the bank order the report. Report ended up being less than perfect. A year later, buyer has a problem with something, consultant didn't find, calls the consultant. First thing the consultant is going to say, I'm sorry, but you aren't my client. The bank was my client. So that's why it's in red. In a perfect world, buyer should have that contractual obligation or that contractual relationship with a consultant, of which their insurance certificate and all the endorsements of the insurance policy should be given to the buyer. And then when the bank has decided, a reliance letter from the consultant to the bank saying you can hereby rely on this report. Even if a bank decides, well, this consultant's not on our list, we got to have somebody review it. Reviewing it is a nominal fee, $350, $500 to review the report by one of their people to say, yes, this meets, the definition of ASTM. They checked all the boxes, and you can rely on the report contents. That'll save some time and it'll save some money on the borrower. Most environmental issues can be addressed. When we started in this business many years ago, the environmental guy was firm was the redheaded stepchild in this business. Nobody wanted to see the environmental person show up because they were the deal killers. So many moons later, decades later, new standards later, people have become more familiar with this. People are used to the banks ordering them. So most things can be addressed. I like using the analogy of a roof. If you hired a building inspector and they went up and looked at the roof and they said the roof is going to cost X to replace it because at the end of its useful life, everybody says, okay, we'll factor that into the deal. We'll give a credit. We'll fix the roof as sellers. Give us 30 days, whatever is negotiated. And it's really not that much different in the environmental world. But sometimes there's that stigma of, oh, it's an environmental issue. This is going to take forever. We're never going to get closed. Regulators are going to be, running around with hazmat suits, and everyone in the neighborhood is going to know what's going on. That doesn't happen too often. That's more in the movies than really the reality that I've seen over the last 20 some odd years. Impacted properties can present opportunities. We represent REITs that love finding contaminated property. They want to get a discount on it. They want to go in and fix it up. They create value. So every property out there, especially on an island where they're not making any more real estate, has some value. Opportunity zones that were part of the 2017 tax reform bill that was passed, they exist in every state. Every governor was tasked with giving locations to the president that they thought would be good for opportunity zones. And they exist. They usually are in the more economically depressed areas, but it was designed to see if there could become an economic engine in those areas. So, you will find environmental issues that exist, but they can become an opportunity. Brownfields redevelopment is always out there. New buyer comes in. It's, the brownfield idea was, let's take all those gas stations on the corner that have been dilapidated for the last, as long as everybody in town can remember. And the reason that existed is not that they weren't valuable. It's because before a brownfields program, the regulators would basically tell the buyer, well, you got to clean it up till you clean it up. And without any sort of cap, developers wouldn't take that risk. Brownfields help sort of mitigate that or find a middle ground. So ultimately, once you go through all the testing, all the investigation, work with an environmental attorney, get the regulators on board, they will cap it. If the estimate is X, there's a cap. One of the other real good benefits of brownfields, and there are a few different ways to go with brownfields, different applications that provide different pros and cons, is the off-site migration. That was a big deterrent to developer. I can clean up the property, but when the regulators tell me now I got to chase this plume down the block, I have no idea how much that's going to cost. Well, the brownfields redevelopment program is there to ensure that all these costs are known, and that became more desirable for the developer. I mean, so sometimes it's not necessarily the number they're trying to tell them. It's $1 billion. Okay, they'll drive away from the property thinking it's only $1 billion. I only have to spend $1 billion to clean it up. Now, obviously, that's an astronomical number, but it's the sort of the psychology of it versus, well, we don't know. And that's the worst thing a developer can hear is we don't know what it's going to cost. So now you are seeing all these corner lots that were former gas stations. They're turning into 7-Elevens and Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts and bank branches because they're usually on corners. Gas stations love corners because there were two means of egress in and out. Well, all these other retail operators love the two egresses as well. So that's why those corner properties do eventually get cleaned up and do eventually get repurposed.
Chuck, we have someone who has raised their hand, so I'm gonna, Vlad, do you have a question? You're able to speak now.
No, thank you. I apologize. I hit the button by accident.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Anyone else at this point?
Ira?
Yes, Chuck, it's Ira Zucker. Quick question. Do you have any connection to be able to dispose of yellow cake?
Yellow cake? That's a uranium product, right?
Correct.
Are you dealing with something now that this is a reality of the world?
Yes.
I have to say no.
Okay. Okay. I'll continue down the paths I'm going.
Okay.
We're here. I give it a shot.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Should I continue?
Yep, I think you can. Mhm.
Okay. I pretty much am at the end of the presentation here. I did want to leave a little time for questions if there were any. Just important to reiterate this 8-year cycle in ASTM, how they approach it. It's a long process. The group is usually broken up into a dozen different committees who are tasked with really going back to the beginning of that section and trying to see how to make it better. As I said before, I participated in that. We had calls monthly and then calls bi-weekly, and finally at the end there were calls weekly to try to get this over the finish line. The cost of the phase 1 reports are starting to rise. And there's several factors to that. With every standard, they require the consultants to require more information. But when you're doing work for lenders, a lot of time there's pressure on the pricing because lenders have several consultants that they use. So you got to be competitive in order to stay on the bank's list. Turnaround time, our firm specialized in doing a 1 to 2 week turnaround time for clients. But it's just starting to become harder and harder. There's more and more information to get our hands on. COVID slowed things down for obvious reasons, but the biggest slowdown was really getting into regulators' offices, building department offices, and trying to get our hands on documents through the Freedom of Information law. They're always very accommodating, they're very helpful, but they are 9 to 5 government workers, and they have their sort of pile of requests to get through each and every day. And for a while, they weren't even at the office. So there is a backup. It is taking longer and longer to get that information. Hopefully that changes, but I'm not in a position to say when that might happen. So the goal of the phase one in ESA is environmental site assessment. Has always been to provide the best information for a client who's going to be making a decision about buying commercial property, or a lender evaluating the potential environmental risk associated with that real estate. So the new ASTM standard helps bolster that objective. The reports were always meant for buyers. It was always meant to give them surplus protection. So just in case the worst of the worst happened, they would have a document. They would have sort of a pathway to be able to avoid having to be brought in to pay any money to clean up some legacy issue that occurred long before they were the owners of the property. Banks do rely on the document just as well as buyers do. But before, when I spoke about, the consultant working for a bank to point out issues that they think the bank may be worried about, but it may not be something that the buyer is worried about. So we got to kind of get those two sort of intents, if you will, and see how we can get them to intersect at a point where, a real estate transaction can happen as quickly as possible.
Leah, did you have a question? Your hand's raised.
Yes, I do. Chuck, I was just wondering regarding remediation. I mean, the buyer pays for phase one and phase two, but inevitably the cost of remediation, which could be very high, is always an issue, or usually an issue. I mean, a lot of times you put in the contract, cap it at a certain amount that the seller is required to spend to remediate. But if it exceeds that amount, sometimes the buyer will chip in and things like that. Do you see a lot of deals ending because of that, or not going through because the remediation is not paid for?
Yeah, it definitely can happen. Like I said before in one of the earlier slides, most environmental impacts do have a good outcome, but it doesn't mean you don't run up against one or two here or there where a dry cleaning impact in shallow groundwater has, migrated out significantly and is going to become a very expensive, drawn out procedure. So the way I can answer it, as you sort of alluded to, just they'll try to cap the amount, and say, all right, seller will pay the first $50,000. Is the buyer willing to take on the risk of any cleanup beyond that? And I think it really comes down to what can be negotiated.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
And just, I've seen situations where, it's a restaurant next to a gas station. The restaurant has no parking. The gas station is up for sale. The owner of the restaurant thinks this is wonderful. I can knock down the gas station building and I can have all this parking for my restaurant. He may be willing to accept a little bit more risk on that property because he's not really going to do anything in the ground. He's not redeveloping the site. So, capping the site, whatever. So there are always reasons why people are drawn to a situation where we may look at it and go, I just don't understand why he would spend all this money on a piece of contaminated property. But that's a good reason why. He's now got all the parking that he's got all the neighbors yelling at him every night and the police coming by every Saturday because people are just parking all over the neighborhood. So it's just an example of where somebody may be willing to take on a little more risk or acquire a piece of property that, the person before them may said, well, I want to put up a new building for my consulting firm, and I got to put in foundations, and I got to do all the site work, and all this environmental stuff is just going to make it too difficult and too long. So I'm going to look for something else. So two potential buyers that had a different risk tolerance for different forward-looking thoughts, if you will, or forward-looking needs.
Right. But if there's a bank involved, they're going to want it clean ultimately.
That is true. You know, again, if we're working with a regulator like the DEC, you can spend a good amount of time evaluating the site, pop in some monitoring wells, see if these level decreases over time. You know, natural attenuation is a big term in our business, because that typically means nobody's going to have to run in there and pay a lot of money. Over time, it will naturally attenuate. So yes, getting a bank comfortable with a situation like that may be a little trickier, because the person buying it is, well, you know, there's no need to run out and just clean it all up today. I'm not digging anything up. So why don't we see if we can, you know, navigate this for a few more months or a year, get some more data. If the levels of contamination are decreasing, you know, maybe that's the ultimate strategy than running in there and cleaning it up. But the person who's going to put a building up as soon as he gets his permits is definitely going to be dealing with a lot more of this, because, you know, phase ones are a great tool. They're a great product. Once you put a backhoe in the ground, you know, it changes the story. If somebody went to a property, and we do these in Brooklyn, you know, it's a piece of vacant land, nothing's ever been on it. Why do I have to do a phase two? Well, you don't have to do a phase two, but if somebody went there in the middle of the night 30 years ago and buried some drums, I'm not going to find that out in a phase one. And the worst thing about the backhoe going in the ground and finding a problem, more than the cost to clean it up, it's going to be the delays. You know,
Yes.
You now have to stop construction because of an environmental issue that nobody was aware of. Those delays are just eating up, you know, the developer's cash. Because once you get the permit, the goal is build as fast as you can, sell it or rent it.
Yes. That's the ultimate goal.
Right. And we understand that.
We have another question from Jeffrey Horn. I'm going to open it up, the mic to him. Jeffrey, are you there?
He's on mute.
Jeffrey, you have to unmute on your side. You have the floor, though.
Hi.
Hi, Jeffrey.
Chuck, could you speak to under what kind of circumstances you are required to report something that you find, or a property owner is required to report findings that result from a phase two?
Great question. It changes. DEC used to have a very strict, any party with knowledge of contamination needed to call it in within 2 hours. Literally, there was a hotline you would call up. The DEC guidelines had sort of changed and nuanced now that the owner of the property has the responsibility to disclose any issues he may have. So consultants do not need to make that phone call the way we used to. We just give our client the report. It'll outline, it should be notified, or the regulators should be notified, it should be reported. And then, you know, people can take that as they will. Sometimes I have found if lawyers are involved with ordering the reports, they're willing to keep it as a, you know, attorney-client privilege. So the requirement of the consultant to call up spills has changed, and we're obligated to tell our client in the report. And again, if it's for a buyer, they're going to tell the seller. And if the seller says, well, I don't want to report it and I don't want to clean it up, you know, that may be a situation where the deal is sort of going to teeter a little bit. But hopefully everybody would be in agreement that, all right, you know, we need to get this done. You know, most of the properties that I'm sure everybody on this call is dealing with are 7 figures and up. So if you're selling a $5 million piece of industrial real estate on Long Island with a $50,000 old tank issue, that's 1% of the value of the property, right? So everybody should be able to see their way clear of getting that done, and, you know, not letting something that's 1% of the value stop the deal. But as I said before, there is a sensitivity to environmental issues.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
We have a question from Gary Shacker. He typed it in. So he says, have you found the county health departments becoming more or less conservative and or cooperative over the last few years?
So Suffolk County Health Department has a program that you can get a no further action letter from. Typically, it involves cleaning out dry wells and septic tanks. Dry wells is actually I just want to go back to a slide here that somehow I missed. I don't know what happened to it. What it discussed was when you find environmental issues that don't necessarily rise to the level of a circular event. There's still something that buyers are concerned about, but it's not like they're going to suddenly end up on a state hazardous waste site list. But they have a program. You work with the two gentlemen there. It can be a little bit drawn out because that's just the way government works. And they are more conservative than ever before. Anytime there's an environmental issue that makes it to the television screen, I'm sure politicians start getting calls from their constituents. Politicians then typically call regulators and go, I'm not going to lose an election this fall because you guys can't get some dry wells cleaned up in Yaphank. So they are more conservative. They live on Long Island. They're drinking the groundwater. So they have an organic concern as well as a job to do. But Nassau County does not have that program. So it's a little more difficult working in Nassau County because you're not going to get a no further action letter. So you have to advise people going in that the best we're going to get is a consultant's report. Hopefully a New York State licensed geologist is involved. They are sort of the creme de la creme of the environmental world. New York State license, made that a licensed industry about 3 or 4 years ago, and that report should stand on its own. Don't know why Nassau County doesn't handle it in-house. Suffolk County charges for their time. There are fees you submit to them. So they're making money for the county to do it, but Nassau County has not adopted that yet. So as a consultant, I'd prefer to work in Suffolk County, knowing at the end of it all, I'm going to get the client a no further action letter. But the question, Gary, and the answer is more conservative with each and every passing year.
Okay.
If there's any other questions, you can raise your hand and I'll give you the floor. I don't see anything else in the queue,
Okay.
Chuck.
All right. So the last slide is how to reach us. It's not that hard to find Merit Environmental on Long Island. I did include my cell phone. Please feel free to use it. If you get a report from someone else, it seems a little funky, give me a call. You know, I'm not saying that I can sprinkle some pixie dust on the report and make the issues that the other consultant wrote go away, because it is a subjective industry. And a consultant may think they're protecting their client as a buyer or protecting their lender with the report. But again, it doesn't mean there isn't an area for compromise. It doesn't mean that there isn't a way that we can get to a middle and everybody, you know, understands. So I welcome calls on my cell phone. I'm always happy to try to help out. And, you know, like everyone else, I've probably been taking more calls on my cell phone than in my office the last 2 years anyway.
That's certainly
Okay,
true.
so, very good. Well, thank you, Chuck, for a very informative and comprehensive presentation. It was excellent. And
My
thank
pleasure.
you all for participating. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.